is sponsored by Raycon.
Who was there with you?
I don't know who it was. I don't know who it was. But somebody else was there.
Gothika tells the story of Dr. Miranda Gray, a psychiatrist of a rural penitentiary who one day awakens as an inmate herself following an obscure car crash where she is said to have brutally murdered her husband and boss, Douglas. From here, Miranda is confronted with the events of the night she can't remember, as her former close colleague Dr. Peter Graham attempts to understand why she did it, all while Miranda believes she is haunted by a mysterious woman she encountered on the night of her crash. So here's the thing, I vividly remember Gothika being heavily marketed back in the day, and came across the VHS and DVD on multiple occasions in my local video store, but I never actually saw it. Despite its immense box office success, Gothika was unsurprisingly loathed by critics for once again being another forgettable piece of derivative uninspired supernatural psychological horror schlock that defined most of the decade. As such, it's said that Gothika left zero lasting impact, as it apparently did nothing to stand out, to the point that you could almost be tricked into thinking you already saw it, which could be said about any film of that era. The film banked almost exclusively on the then current hot streak of Halle Berry, who was fresh off the success of X-Men 2, Die Another Day, and her Academy Award-winning performance in Monsters Ball, just before facing the dreaded post-Catwoman years. Yet, there are many other seasoned performers who help sell the film as seemingly above and beyond the usual Hollywood horror, such as John Carroll Lynch, Charles Dutton, Bernard Hill, Penelope Cruz, and of course Robert Downey Jr., who was just beginning his incredible career revival. It certainly seemed to aim for a slightly higher level of prestige, or at least the illusion of it, because for directing duties, producer Joel Silver hired Matthew fucking Kassovitz. Now, who is Matthew Kassovitz, you may ask? Well, for me, he made one of, if not the greatest French films ever, called La Haine, which obtained massive critical acclaim and numerous accolades for its gritty, bleak portrayal of the marginalized areas of 90s Paris. Culturally, it's a very significant film in world cinema and was one of the earliest ones I ever properly studied, so it's burnt right into my skull. But what's interesting about this was that while Kassovitz became really popular within snooty auteur film circles, I believe it's been noted that he always just wanted to be a big blockbuster director, and Gothika was pretty much his opportunity to prove himself in Hollywood. Unfortunately, that didn't really work out. He used his salary from Gothika to adapt a long-term passion project called Babylon AD, which is probably one of the most boring films I've ever seen, but it was important to him, so fair play for following his ambitions. Anyway, two other significant production credits worth mentioning include production designer Graham Grace Walker, who previously worked as art director on Mad Max 2 and did production on Ghost Ship and House of Wax, hence the alluring aesthetic. And if by now you think the film looks beautiful or at least interestingly shot, they hired Matthew Labatique as the cinematographer, who is best known for his work on Darren Aronofsky films. Basically, what I'm saying is there was a fair amount of talent working on Gothika, and I think that even if the script wasn't on par with the visuals, the way it's delivered stylistically is very captivating. Now, before we go into the specifics of the story, usually you hear about how trailers spoil the entire plot. Well, I've seen the trailer for Gothika countless times throughout my life, and after watching the entire film for the first time before making this video, I was really caught off guard by how little the trailer actually shows. No spoilers until later in the video, but the trailer only shows stuff within the first half of the movie. There's a bit more to talk about that I'll admit I didn't catch on to despite how supposedly predictable the movie is. I'm not usually someone who tries to outsmart a film and get ahead of the plot, but I did write down a prediction on what I thought was going to happen, and while I was partially right, the other part, I was way off. Now, just before we dive any further, I want to give a shout out to this video sponsor, Raycon. I watch most of the horror movies I review while wearing these cozy wee earbuds because they consistently provide me with the sharp, punchy quality needed to absorb myself into the atmosphere, while helping to isolate obnoxious distractions such as traffic and seemingly never-ending construction work. Seriously, what the hell are my neighbors up to? Their instantaneous Bluetooth connection means it's super easy for me to simply pull up the last podcast on the left on Spotify, press play, and zone out with my morning coffee. Raycon earbuds have a 32-hour battery life thanks to their accessible charging case, and also come packed with gel tips for any ear size, which, unlike most cheap earbuds I've previously used, don't just constantly fall out at random. Raycon start at half the price of other premium audio brands without a dent in the quality, and if you're not satisfied, Raycon offer a 45-day happiness guarantee, so you have nothing to lose. Why not make the most of the last weeks of summer and prepare yourself for the spooky autumn season by clicking the link in the description box below or going to buyraycon.com/Ryan to get 15% off your order. I guess given the talent put behind it, you could say Gothika definitely shows hints of wanting to be a more sophisticated horror, for lack of a better word. I mean, I'm not talking about that stupid elevated bollocks Twitter snobs go on about. What I mean is, there is a character drama somewhere in here that's left largely unexplored in favour of breaking up the slow-paced interactions with conventional scares. The screenplay simply struggles to make sense or follow through with many of its ideas, despite treading over a really poignant subject matter that mirrors many real-world issues. The general theme of the story is about victims not being believed and having to contend with constant belittlement from people who just refuse to listen to them when they are truly trapped and helpless.
You think I did this to myself, don't you?
Did you?
Again, it doesn't really follow through to the extent it needs to make it fully meaningful, but the whole idea behind Miranda's character journey is that she starts to empathize with the experiences of her psychologically troubled patients.
You can't trust someone who thinks you're crazy.
In the opening, Miranda's patient Chloe claims that she is repeatedly raped by the devil, but is constantly dejected by Miranda not taking her seriously. This is because Chloe believes Miranda has labelled her as crazy, and thus her story will only ever be seen by Miranda as a fantastical embellishment of Chloe's harrowing experiences at the hands of her own stepfather, who she murdered for the same reason she claims the devil torments her. This interaction is then deliberately recycled following Miranda's own incarceration for murdering her husband and penitentiary boss Douglas, as Pete persistently tries to have her recount and acknowledge the events of that fateful evening. He doesn't outright say he doesn't believe her, but his attitude and unemotive expression says it all, as most of the time it seems like Miranda is talking to a brick wall with everyone she interacts with, as they all seem to dismiss her as, well, crazy. Miranda and Chloe effectively represent a duality where they start at opposite ends and eventually find unity in between when Miranda begins to see the world through Chloe's eyes. The film is atmospherically very cold and oppressive, and it works to reinforce how unsafe and undignified Miranda now feels being on the other side. It even throws in this recurring conflict about medicating the inmates, as Miranda believes it to suppress their ability to unlock their traumas and experiences, which is exactly what happens to her when Pete has her medicated. Yet, it all works to further compound this sense of dehumanization, where despite these doctors claiming to want to help the inmates before they're put on trial in front of a less sympathetic judge and jury, they're ultimately just as desensitized. All they seem to do is claim the patients are embellishing or fabricating stories to avoid admitting their own wrongdoings, and this is a concept proven to be contentious in certain circles of psychological profiling. For example, we continuously see Pete attempting to diagnose Miranda's behavior only for her to get ahead of his diagnosis, showing how they're all following the exact same playbook instead of actually listening to Miranda and taking what she says seriously.
Disorganized
I don't know
speech,
how she's
frequent
connected to
derailment,
me, but
and
she is.
incoherence.
Don't run
That's what
off
I
your
said.
psychiatric shit to me. I know that like the back of my hand.
Good! Good.
To be clear, there is a deep complexity to how this all works in the medical world, and I'm in no position to appropriately comment on it, but as a work of fiction, I feel it handles its subject matter with a surprising level of thoughtfulness compared to almost every Hollywood movie at the time. As I've said before, mental illness is often not portrayed too kindly in Hollywood movies, with many of them spreading harmful misconceptions, especially towards schizophrenia, yet how movies like Gothika navigate it is by just not stating the illness, and leaving everything all vague and jargonistic. Specifically with Gothika, the focus is more on Miranda being unable to prove her sanity when placed in a situation that has conditioned her to be an inescapable label that slowly becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, if these rational professional doctors tell me I'm insane, or at least make me question it, then maybe I am, yet since Miranda has already seen the world through their eyes, she's stronger in her willingness to dispute it. Now, conversely to the psychological, we do need to talk about the supernatural, because what gets us to this central conflict is that the mysterious woman in white Miranda encounters on the night of the murder continues to torment her in prison. So here's the thing, originally I felt the movie made a mistake in showing us too much of Miranda's encounter with the woman before her husband's murder, which itself is conveyed through abstract flashbacks that eventually get pieced together. As the audience, we know by the framing that Miranda did unambiguously see this woman and did have some sort of an altercation, and I thought this was going to contradict any attempt by the film to play up uncertainty as to whether Miranda was crazy or not. However, Gothika surprisingly doesn't play into that trope. It doesn't try to make you doubt Miranda, you are totally on her side, and as I explained, where the suspense ultimately lies is in seeing how Miranda convinces these people that she is telling the truth. And it does this by simply transitioning from a psychological horror into a supernatural one, as Miranda tries to figure out how this woman is connected to her and what it is that she wants. Although before we get into the spoilers, I do want to address a bit of symbolism that does shed more light on the story's central theme, because what kind of pretentious prick would I be without just a little overindulgence? So I will admit that subtlety is not Gothika's strong point when it comes to letting you interpret any of the imagery, because it just outright explains everything to you. It leans heavily on this recurring motif of streams of water and rain as a way of visually representing how we distort our intake of reality and blur the line between fact and fiction, which is reflected in both Chloe and Miranda's experiences. But the major symbol that drives the second half of the story is when Miranda escapes her cell and witnesses Chloe being raped by the devil, and what we see is a chest tattoo of Anima Sola. Pete explains, because he just so happens to have random knowledge on specific archetypical religious imagery, that Anima Sola is the image of a woman in chains and on fire whose soul is trapped in purgatory.
Don't you see how this image is tailor-made for your state of mind? A woman in purgatory.
But what Pete does is push the narrative that Miranda is fabricating this image into reality to explain her own circumstances, and thus mirrors exactly how Miranda dismissed Chloe's story about the devil in the beginning of the film. As I said, we know Miranda is telling the truth. There is no ambiguity in her story bar the murder itself, which we now know has something to do with her encounter with the ghostly woman, who of course truly represents the woman trapped in purgatory. From here on out, we are entering spoiler territory for the final act of the story, so as always, brace yourself. So surely I wasn't the only person who thought Robert Downey Jr. was going to be the villain, right? I know it seemed too obvious, but movies back then were not good at hiding things. My prediction was that the woman in white was a girl Pete assaulted and murdered, and now she was stuck in purgatory and had possessed Miranda into discovering the truth so that her soul could be set free. That latter part, I fucking nailed it, but Pete is a total misdirection. I never considered the husband Douglas purely because I sort of forgot about him, as there's nothing to be learned about his character prior to his death. I mean, I should have suspected something considering he was the murder victim, but I'm not the sharpest person out there. The reveal sees Miranda escape from the penitentiary and return to the scene of the crime, where she discovers that yes, she was possessed by the woman into murdering Douglas. The woman in question, called Rachel, was the daughter of another doctor, who was believed to have committed suicide when in fact Douglas had assaulted and murdered her as part of his twisted snuff film collection. Yeah, don't you fucking dare tell me you saw that bit coming. Upon Miranda's discovery, the police arrive and find that Douglas had another woman trapped in the basement still alive, and so Rachel's ultimate goal was to expose Douglas to appease the souls of the unavenged. However, we're not done yet. Earlier in the story, Rachel carved "not alone" into Miranda's arm, and this plays a significant role into going from Miranda assuming it was to prove the existence of the supernatural into revealing that Douglas was not alone and there were two killers involved. Honestly, I should have been onto John Carroll Lynch's character like a fly on shit, because there's no way you cast him in a horror story and not have him be a villain in some capacity. Yep, he is the one with the Anima Sola tattoo on his chest. He is the devil Chloe refers to, and it adds a truly frightening realistic perspective to everything we've learnt. John Carroll Lynch plays Sheriff Bob Ryan, who not only has power and authority from his profession, but being best friends with Douglas, who has power, authority, and access to all the vulnerable women in the penitentiary, means this fucking monster can get away with assaulting helpless victims, and because of their circumstances, nobody will likely believe them. That is the true horror of Gothika. It is a devastating portrayal of victims without a voice. Again, I don't think it completely nails the execution, but having it end with Miranda now free from prison but still haunted by other souls left unavenged helps bring home a point about truly listening and uncovering the real truth. In the same way Miranda apologizes to Chloe for not listening, Pete eventually does the same, and thankfully Bob gets his ironic comeuppance when the spirit of Rachel tricks him into igniting a gas pipe and engulfing him in flames. Admittedly, I had fairly low expectations going into Gothika given the bad things I had heard about it, but I walked away really impressed, no surprise there. Like, I know I'm a softie for these kinds of films, but I really miss charming, far-fetched ghost stories because movies like The Conjuring just don't do it for me. So in the comments below, help me feed the algorithm gods by recommending a supernatural horror that does not deserve the critical scathing that it received. And until next time, stay safe, always remember to listen, and I'll see you all very soon.